I've been driving the same circuit for 11 years. 32 stops, give or take a seasonal adjustment. You learn a route the way you learn a kitchen, where the light falls in the morning, which floorboard creaks, where the good drawer is. You stop thinking about it consciously. Your hands just know. Stop 12 on my Thursday sheet was Theron Resettlement Depot. I want to be clear about what that place looked like, because the way I saw it and the way the rest of the region saw it were not quite the same thing. The way most people described it when they described it at all was that holding yard out on the flats, usually with a particular flatness in their own voice that meant they'd already decided the subject wasn't worth the breath. It sat about 30 kilometers east of Corval Junction, out where the road stopped being maintained and became a suggestion, surrounded by scrubland that smelled of dry chalk and the particular mineral sharpness that comes off rock in the first heat of the morning. The perimeter was chain-link fence with a corroded top rail and a sign in 4 scripts that said, in each of them, something slightly different. The Colony Authority's version said, temporary transitional housing. The Freight Guild's version said, non-commercial drop point, and the Corf administrative label, which no one had bothered to take down from the original prefab gates, said defective stock processing. Velthara Subbreed Holding. I noticed the last one the 3rd week I was running the route. I wrote it down in the margin of my trip log because it bothered me in a way I couldn't quite name, and I've never been a man who ignores things that bother him without at least marking them down. The Velthara colony had been there for 14 months by the time I started running that route. They'd been driven out of the Corv mountain territories in what the official communiques called a reclassification of breeding stock, which was the kind of language that covered a great deal of ground if you didn't ask follow-up questions. 41 dragons. Later, I learned the original colony had been 63, but some hadn't survived the transit relocation, and some had dispersed and hadn't been rounded up at all, and the 22 who were missing were entered in a column in the Corv ledger under inventory variants. I read that in a document I wasn't supposed to see later, and I spent a long time after reading it sitting in my truck, looking at my hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing you noticed about the Velthara, if you bothered to look past the fence, was the color, or rather the absence of color. The presence of white where the color should have been. In a world where most dragons I'd seen on the colony were scaled in the deep ochres and slate grays and storm blacks that most people associated with them, the Velthara were something else entirely. Their scales were a pale off-white, not the white of fresh snow, but the white of old bone or of sea salt drying in the sun, a slightly warm, living white that caught light differently at different angles. Some of them, particularly the older ones, had a faint yellowing at the ridgelines, the way good ivory goes at the edges. Their eyes were amber. The young ones had brighter amber, almost orange, and the oldest among them had eyes the color of old whiskey held up to a window. Their wings were the strangest part. The membrane was translucent in the way that very thin skin is translucent. You could see the vascular structure underneath when they unfurled in. The morning light, a faint tracery of darker lines like the skeleton of a leaf. When they spread their wings to take the early sun, which they did, most mornings, standing in rows along the eastern fence in a way that looked almost ceremonial. The light came through the membranes in a pale amber glow, and for about 15 minutes at the right hour, the whole yard had a quality to it that I didn't have a word for. Not beautiful exactly, or not only beautiful. Something older than that. Nobody else on the Corval Junction freight circuit stopped at the depot. My predecessor on the route had listed it as a non-commercial drop point and filed a note saying the access road damaged vehicle undercarriages and the paperwork processing time made the stop economically marginal. Both of those things were true. The road was bad, and the paperwork was never fast. The paperwork was never fast because the Velthara did not have a colony administrator. They'd had one, a colony authority liaison named Drevich, for the first 2 months. But he'd been reassigned when budget reviews determined that a colony of 41 non-productive displaced units didn't warrant a full-time administrator. After that, the paperwork for depot deliveries had to be processed and signed by the ranking member of the colony itself. That was Sale. Sale was the oldest of the Velthara. I never learned exactly how old. From the depth of the yellowing on her scale ridges and the way her movements carried the careful economy of a creature who had learned, over a very long time, not to waste motion unnecessarily, I put her somewhere past 300. Her amber eyes had gone the darkest of any of them, that deep peat-brown whiskey shade that barely registered as amber anymore. She was still large. Not as large as some of the warrior-class dragons I'd seen in freight manifests, described as cargo escorts, but large. Her shoulder came up to about the level of my forehead when she was sitting, which was most of the time. She moved when she needed to and not otherwise. The first time I rang the depot gate and waited for someone to come, I stood for maybe 12 minutes in the chalk-smelling heat before I heard the slow, deliberate sound of her coming across the yard. There was a deliberate quality to her footsteps, not slowness exactly, but the weight of attention, as if she was choosing each step. She came around the side of a prefab storage building and stopped about 3 meters from the gate and looked at me. I held up the manifest. She looked at it, then at me. I said, "Morning. I've got a delivery, medical supplies, depot allocation, colony authority shipment. I need a recipient's signature on lines 4 and 7. She kept looking at me. I had the impression I was being measured in some way, though the scale wasn't clear to me. I said, "I can read you the line items if that helps. Wound seal compound, 8 canisters. Nutritional supplement blocks, 40 units. That's 1 per colony member per week. Sorry, I know it's not a lot. That's what the allocation order says. Atmospheric processing fluid for the habitat units, 6 drums. And 1 replacement manifold for the water recycling array, which I was told you requisitioned 6 weeks ago. That's why it took so long. Parts lead time." Her head tilted very slightly to the right. I added, "The manifold took a while because it had to come from a supplier who makes fittings for older habitat unit models. And apparently the original requisition got flagged for budget review twice before it cleared. I made a note about it. It shouldn't happen again." She looked at the manifest for another moment. Then, with a deliberateness that matched her walk, she lowered her head and touched the receiving pad with the tip of 1 claw. The Korth colonial system's equivalent of a signature, a pressure mark from a colony member registered in the administrative database. The pad registered, the form closed. I gave her the hard copy, which she held in 1 claw with a careful precision that told me she'd be filing it correctly. "Same time next Thursday," I said. "I'll have the next allocation. If you've got a requisition list ready, I can make sure it gets in the system this week so it doesn't run late." She looked at me for 1 moment more. I said, "My name's Tomás Reyes. I'll be running this route from now on." She turned and walked back around the prefab building without a word. I stood at the gate for a second, then noted the signature on my trip log, marked the stop completed, and got back in the truck. That was the beginning of it. In the truck on the way back to the junction that first Thursday, I turned the interaction over in the way I turn most things over. Not quickly, and not with any particular drama, but steadily, the way you might turn a stone in your hands to find the flat side. What I kept coming back to was the gate sign. Defective stock processing. The word defective applied to a creature who had come to receive a supply manifest and signed each required line with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what the paperwork was for. I've dealt with a lot of administrative points of contact over 11 years of route driving. Most of them don't read what they sign. Sale had read every line. I filed a note in my trip log. Depot requires attention. Review allocation accuracy before next Thursday. That was all. But I meant it the way I mean notes, which is completely with follow-through. I started keeping a separate log for the depot, not because the system required it. It didn't, but because the colony authority's allocation files were a mess, And if I was going to advocate effectively for the Velthara in the supply chain, which I had decided I was going to do, I needed to know exactly what they were getting, what they were supposed to be getting, and what the gap between those two numbers was. The gap, as it turned out, was substantial. The nutritional supplement allocation was calibrated for a colony of 30, not 41. Someone had entered an old population estimate, and nobody had corrected it. The medical supply allocation used a multiplier that was standard for temperate zone colonies, but the Theron flats ran hot and dry in a way that increased dermal moisture loss in scaled species, which meant the wound seal compound in particular ran out well before the resupply window. The water's recycling array was a model that should have been on a maintenance contract, but it had been transferred to the depot without the contract, which meant every repair had to go through emergency procurement. That was why the manifold had taken 6 weeks. I logged all of it. I started a corrections file. Every week before my Thursday run, I'd check the current allocation against the log, find the discrepancies, and file correction requests with the Colony Authority Supply Office. Most of them got rejected the first time. About a third of them got approved on second submission. A few required me to talk to a supervisor, which I did in the same way I did everything, steadily, with documentation, without raising my voice. By the 3rd month, the nutritional allocation had been corrected to 41 units. By the 5th month, the medical supply multiplier had been adjusted for the local climate conditions. By the 7th month, I had the water recycling array on a proper maintenance contract. None of this was dramatic. It was paperwork. But paperwork, done correctly and persistently, is how things actually get better for people. And for dragons. I don't draw much of a distinction, Sale noticed. I don't mean she made a speech or gave me a look I could have filmed and explained to someone later. She wasn't that kind of creature, but I noticed that she started being at the gate before I rang it. And that when I came around with the allocation breakdown to show her what had been corrected and what was still pending, she looked at the documents with an attention that had changed in quality. Less the careful measuring of a stranger and more the focused attention of someone reviewing work they cared about. She started leaving requisition lists on the receiving shelf inside the gate rather than having someone bring them out when I asked. She would touch each item with her claw tip as I read the list back to her, which I took to be confirmation. She never spoke to me those first months. I'm not sure she spoke much to anyone. The other Velthara spoke to each other. I could hear them through the fence, a low harmonic vocalization that had a musical quality to it, almost choral, rising and falling in ways that suggested structure. But Sale was mostly quiet. She communicated what she needed to communicate. She did not fill silence. I respect that in a person, or a dragon. The distinction, as I've said, is not one I make much of. What I also noticed, in those early months, was that word of the root correction was apparently circulating inside the colony. Not because anyone told me. No one spoke to me but Sale for the first several months, but because of the way the yard changed when I pulled in on Thursdays. In the beginning, only Sale and whoever she designated to carry the supplies would be near the gate area when I arrived. By month 3, there were often several others within sight of the gate, moving at their business, but positioned in a way that was also watching. Not hostile, not begging, just present, accounting for the fact that I had come, that I was coming regularly, that the correction to the nutritional blocks had happened between one Thursday and the next. And my truck was the visible mechanism of that. I didn't acknowledge this, not because I was indifferent to it, but because I didn't know how to acknowledge it without making something larger of the moment than the moment warranted. I drove in, I delivered, I showed Sale the corrections status, I drove out. Week after week, that was what happened. That consistency was, I think, probably the most useful thing I offered in those early months. Not the advocacy, though I hoped that was useful, but the simple, dull fact of arriving, of being a Thursday thing. Something you could rely on not to be absent. The corrections didn't get easier as time went on, by the way. Each one opened onto the next. Fixing the population count revealed that the supplemental bedding and material allocation used the same wrong number, so that had to be corrected separately through a different form pathway. Correcting the medical supply multiplier turned up a linked formula error in the emergency response provision, which required a submission through the Colony Authority's Health Compliance Office, which was staffed by one part-time administrator who processed requests in order of receipt and was currently 11 weeks behind. I put the emergency response correction in the queue and noted the estimated clearance date and moved on to the next item. There was always a next item. The administrative neglect of the Velthara wasn't a single error. It was a structure, a set of assumptions baked into every layer of the form system. Assumptions that a colony classified as defective stock didn't require the same standards, the same response times, the same careful accounting. Correcting it was like taking apart a wall someone had built one brick at a time over 2 years. You take out one brick, and there are 20 more behind it. You do it anyway. You come back the next Thursday, and you take out more. The young ones started coming to the gate around month 4. I don't know what the Velthara named among themselves. I wasn't privy to that, and I wasn't going to ask. In my trip log, I called him Pale, which was not an imaginative choice but was accurate, and I've never claimed to be a poet. He was small, not a hatchling past that stage, but young in the way that a creature's joints haven't fully settled yet, where there's still a slight looseness to the way the limbs connect to each other. His scales were the brightest white of any of them, with a faint iridescence that the older ones didn't have, a hint of something like pearl in direct sunlight. His eyes were that brilliant orange amber of the young. He would come to the fence and sit about 2 meters back, always exactly 2 meters. I noticed as if he'd measured it and watched me work the delivery. He didn't approach. He didn't make sounds. He watched. I talked while I worked because I talk while I work. It's not a conversational habit. It's more like thinking out loud with an audience that doesn't require a response. I told him about the allocation corrections I was still working through. I told him about the water recycling contract and how the response time for service calls was still longer than it should be, but I was working on a performance clause. I told him that the nutritional blocks weren't adequate long-term, and I had filed a formal complaint with the Colony Authority, Nutritional Standards Board, which was a slow process but not an unwinnable one. He kept his amber eyes on me the whole time. I started leaving a corner of my lunch on the receiving shelf when I packed up to leave, not on the shelf inside the gate. I couldn't access that without the gate code, which I didn't have, but on the flat top of the gate post, which was wide enough to hold a folded cloth with whatever I'd kept back. I didn't make anything of it. I just left it and got in the truck. I ate a lunch with one corner gone the same as I'd eaten lunches with 2 corners or 3. You calibrate. The 3rd week I did this, I came back the following Thursday and found a small flat stone on the gate post. It was pale, smooth, about the size of my palm, river-smoothed, faintly iridescent in the way that certain stones go when they've been in water long enough. There was no river within 40 kilometers of Theron. I stood looking at it for a moment. Then I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, and felt the smoothness of it. That particular worn smoothness that takes time, that is the accumulated effect of 1,000 small moments of moving water. Wherever Pale had found it, it had not been found recently. It was old in the way that stones are old. It had been kept somewhere, I thought. Carried. I put it in the door pocket of the truck and drove away. I still have it. There are things I noticed about the Velthara over those months that I wrote down in the log not because they were relevant to supply allocations, but because I didn't want to forget them. They sang in the mornings. Not every morning, but most. The harmonic vocalization I'd noticed through the fence was deliberate and collective. All 41 of them would settle into positions and produce a rising tone that started below the range of full hearing and moved upward through it. Standing at the gate during one of these, early on a clear day with the chalk smell and the pale morning light coming in level from the east, I felt it in my sternum before I heard it in my ears. It lasted about 20 minutes. Then they dispersed and went about their day. They maintained the habitat units themselves. The colony authorities' maintenance provision was intermittent at best, but I never saw a leaking seal or a damaged panel that they hadn't already patched, however provisionally. They had organized the yard in a way that had a logic to it. Shelter clustered on the western side against the afternoon heat, the open ground on the eastern side for the morning sun spreading that seemed to matter to them. They kept the space clean in a way that the original freight yard would never have suggested was possible. They looked after each other. That was the most fundamental thing. The older ones spent time with the younger ones in what looked like instruction. I couldn't tell in what, but it had the quality of passing something along. The ones who were still recovering from the relocation transit. There were several who had injuries that the wound seal compound was working on slowly, were tended consistently by others, never left alone when they were in clear discomfort. They were not dispirited. That's what I want to say carefully, because there was every reason in the world for them to be, and some of the time I could see the weight of it in the way they held themselves. Sail, especially, in the very early morning before the singing started, when she sat alone on the eastern side and looked out over the scrubland as if she was calculating something long and patient. But they were not broken by it. Whatever was in them was still in them, still intact. I thought about that a lot during the drives between stops. The colony authority inspector came in month 9 and gave the depot a compliance review. He was a young man named Ferris who wore a pressed uniform and carried a handheld assessment device and moved through the yard with the hurried efficiency of someone who had 17 other sites to review before the end of the fiscal quarter. He was not unkind, exactly. He just wasn't present. I happened to be there for the tail end of my Thursday delivery when he came through. I watched him walk the perimeter, look at the habitat units, check the supply storage against his list. He flagged the water recycling array, said the maintenance record showed it had only recently been brought to standard. I told him I'd arranged that. He looked at me, slightly surprised, and said drivers didn't normally handle facility maintenance contracting. I told him I'd noticed it was falling outside protocol and had corrected it. He wrote something on his device. He flagged the nutritional block allocation as recently adjusted. I told him it had been incorrect for the colony's population count, and I'd corrected it. He wrote something else. He looked around the yard, at the Velthara going about their morning. Pale watching from his 2-meter radius, Sail sitting still near the eastern habitat row, a group of the younger adults doing something with the far fence corner that involved what looked like a systematic cleaning of the corroded sections. He said, "Do they give you any trouble?" The assessment protocols flagged this subbreed as high volatility. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "They sing in the mornings. They maintain their own facilities better than the maintenance contract requires. They file accurate requisition lists and keep copies of all their delivery receipts. I don't know what criteria the assessment protocol uses for volatility, but by the criteria I use, they're about as low volatility as any stop on my route." He wrote something on his device. He gave the depot a passing rating. He left. I watched him go with a feeling I would not have been able to name precisely. Not anger. Anger runs hot, and I don't, mostly. Something quieter. The sense that a person had walked through a place carrying a checklist and walked out again without having looked at it. Not maliciously, just because looking at it wasn't on the checklist. The checklist said, water recycling, check. Nutritional allocation, check. Medical supply, check. The checklist did not say, notice that they sing in the mornings. It did not say, look at how they tend each other, how they've organized the yard so the heat hits the right side and the light hits the other, how they keep every record they're given and file the copies in a dry location so they don't degrade. None of that was on the form. I stood in the yard after he left for a moment, looking at the space he'd moved through, which hadn't changed at all for his having been in it. Then I picked up my delivery board and finished loading out. Syl had been within earshot. I didn't look at her when I said what I said, and she didn't look at me afterward. But when I was packing up the truck and she was walking back toward the habitat units, she paused in a way that wasn't quite a stop and held herself with a quality that wasn't quite an acknowledgement. Close enough, I thought. Close enough. The Korthal archivists arrived at the beginning of month 11, and I want to explain who they were and why it mattered, because at the time I didn't understand either of those things. The Korthal Empire was not a concept I'd had much occasion to think about before. I knew it existed the way you know that mountains exist on a continent you've never visited, present in the general shape of the world, not personally relevant. The Korvth Reach, which had expelled the Velthara, was a regional power under Korthal's broader civilizational umbrella, but the Korthal themselves were older and larger, and not something the colony freight circuit intersected in day-to-day operations. The archivists were 3 of them, all ancient by the look of them. Not as ancient as Sale, I thought, but old enough that their movement had that same quality of long experience translated into economy. Their scales were a deep slate gray that had the almost metallic quality that seems to come with true age in scaled species. They had the bearing of creatures that had been walking through records offices and administrative archives for longer than most institutions in the colony had existed. They came with a Korthal documentation vehicle and a colony authority escort who clearly did not understand who he was escorting. The escort kept referring to the archivists as your delegation in a tone that suggested routine formality. The archivists said very little to him. They were not rude about it. They simply did not have time for it in the way that certain very old and very serious people have no time for things that carry no information. I saw the vehicle on the way out of the depot that Thursday. I'd arrived for my delivery, done the run, and was packing up when it came through the gate. And what I noticed most was the quality of attention that the Velthara gave it. They did not crowd toward it or show anything that I would have called excitement, but they held themselves differently than I'd seen them hold themselves in any of the previous 11 months. A kind of stillness that had something watchful in it, like a long patient calculation coming to a final step. They spent 2 days at the depot. I wasn't there for most of it. It wasn't a Thursday, but I heard about it from Ferris, who called me because I'd apparently become the closest thing to an informed point of contact the colony had in the freight system. He said the archivists were conducting a lineage census, which was apparently a procedure within Korthal administrative law that could be triggered when a colony's status was under formal review. He didn't know what had triggered the review. He didn't know what a lineage census meant in practice. He said it seemed thorough. When I came on Thursday that week, something had changed in the quality of the depot's silence. I can't describe it better than that. The Velthara were going about the same routines I'd seen every Thursday for the past months. The morning sun, spreading, the cleaning rotations, the careful maintenance of the habitat units. But there was a different weight to it. Not tension exactly. Something more like attention held in reserve. Sale was at the gate before I'd reached the entrance road. That was new. She was usually at the gate before I rang, had been for months. But she had always waited there in her usual stillness, looking at the gate as if it were the next piece of a long problem she was working through. Today, she was standing closer to the gate than I'd seen her stand, and her amber eyes tracked me as I pulled in and shut off the engine with an alertness that had something different in it, not urgency. Something older than urgency. I got out, got the delivery board, brought the manifest. She signed. I handed her the allocation breakdown. She didn't look at it. She said, "They found what they came for." Her voice, the first time I heard it, was nothing like I would have predicted if I'd tried to predict it, which I never had. It was low and carried a resonance that you felt in the bones of the inner ear before the sound itself arrived. Not loud, not threatening, like a chord struck on an instrument you've never heard before, but that the body recognizes anyway. I said, "The archivists?" She said, "Yes." I waited, Because I've learned that waiting is almost always the right response to almost everything, she said. They found the bloodline record in our colony's germline documentation. It had been in the Corv holding archive, and they had not read it carefully. Or had read it and not understood what they were reading. The Velthara line is not what the Corvith administration classified it as. I said, "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming in from the east, and the Velthara along the fence had begun their sun spreading, and the pale amber glow of light through their wing membranes moved slowly across the ground as they shifted to face it. She said, "The archivists used the term origin strain. The color that the Korth called a defect, the albinism, is not a degenerative marker. It is the oldest marker, the first fire expressed in the scale. All of Korthal's bloodlines descend from lines that carried this coloring. Before the dominant pigmentation became established over generations of interbreeding with the mountain clans. We were not defective, we were the source." I thought about the sign on the original gate. Defective stock processing. I thought about the word inventory variance in the column where 22 dragons were missing. I said carefully, "That's going to change things." She said, "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You filed 14 administrative complaints on our behalf in 11 months. I said, 15, if you count the one about the compliance inspector's volatility classification, which I submitted after his review. Something happened at the edge of her expression. In a creature with a face structured as differently as hers was from mine, I couldn't have called it a smile. But it was in that family, she said. 15. I said, "Some of them didn't go anywhere. The nutritional standards complaint is still in review. I'm going to follow up on it next week," she said. "I know." We stood there for a moment in the morning. I said, "Do you know what happens next?" "After the archivist's report," she said, "a first envoy will come from the Korthal seat to conduct a formal recognition assessment. This is the procedure." She paused. "It is not a fast procedure," I said. "I'll still be running this route on Thursdays." She looked at me. Then she looked out at the scrubland beyond the fence, the way she sometimes did in the early morning, when I thought she was calculating something. "Long," she said. "Yes, I thought you would." She took her copy of the manifest and walked back across the yard. The first envoy's convoy arrived on a Tuesday, which meant I heard about it from Ferris again before I saw it myself. He called and said there were 4 large vehicles with Korthal insignia on the access road, and the colony authority had been given 12 hours notice and was scrambling to prepare appropriate reception protocols. I told him to make sure they didn't serve the standard colony liaison refreshment package, which I knew from experience was inadequate for warm weather venues. He said that wasn't his department. I said he should make it his department for the next 12 hours. By Thursday, the convoy was still at the depot. That was how large the undertaking was. I drove out on my regular schedule. The access road was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. 2 Korthal administrative vehicles were parked along the shoulder, and there was a colony authority liaison van near the gate with 2 staffers sitting in it who looked like they'd been there since Tuesday and wished they hadn't. I pulled up, got my delivery board, unfolded the manifest. The gate was open, which it never was. I walked in. The depot yard was transformed in a way that was hard to quantify because the physical changes were modest. Nothing had been built or dismantled, but the presence of the Korthal made the space feel different, the way a concert hall feels different when it's full compared to when it's empty. There were 8 of them in the yard, all large, all carrying the same deep slate gray of the archivists, along with the gold and black insignia of the Korthal seat that I recognized from the vehicles outside. They were standing in various positions around the yard, some speaking with Velthara colony members, some reviewing documents on portable archival systems. The Velthara were not changed in any observable way that I could point to. They were still themselves. Same positions, same careful economy of movement. But the way they held themselves had a quality I hadn't seen before. Not pride exactly, because they had always had that, quietly in the way they maintained their own yard, while the colony authority pretended they didn't exist. Something else. Like a door that has been closed for a long time and is now, for the first time, standing open. Pale was not in his usual spot 2 meters from the gate. He was on the eastern side of the yard, sitting close to one of the younger Korthal administrative officers, and I could see them exchanging a vocalization that seemed, from the quality of it, like something that was being learned, a word, or the shape of a word. I walked to the loading dock. The first envoy was standing near the far end of it, reviewing a document with 2 of the administrative officers. I had not seen the envoy before, but I knew immediately, the same way you know certain things without having a reason to, that this was who I was looking at. Not from the insignia, though the insignia was more elaborate than the others. From the way the space around them organized itself. From the way the Korthal officers tilted their bodies slightly toward the envoy, and the Velthara near the eastern fence moved in a way that acknowledged the envoy's presence without looking directly at it. From the quality of attention that gathered near the envoy the way weather gathers before a front. The envoy's scales were not the slate gray of the others. They were dark gold, the color of old wood where the lacquer has gone deep, and the grain shows through in long, warm lines. The eyes were darker amber than any I'd seen, in any colony I'd delivered to. I went to the receiving station on the dock, put down the delivery board, found the signature line, I said, to the nearest colony authority staffer who had materialized near me looking uncertain. I need a recipient signature on lines 4 and 7, allocation delivery for the depot. The staffer looked at the first envoy. The first envoy looked at me. I held up the manifest. The envoy looked at the manifest, then at me, then said, in a voice that had a deeper resonance than sails, and a quality like sound carried through stone. "You are the freight driver," I said. "Tomás Reyes. I run the Thursday circuit. I also had a delivery from 3 weeks ago that still needs its confirmation signature. If the admin system didn't close it automatically, I'll need a physical signature on the hard copy." There was a silence. Sail appeared, moving from somewhere behind me with her careful, deliberate step, and came to stand at the corner of the loading dock. She did not look at me. She looked at the envoy. The envoy said to Sail, "This is the one you described in the colony's formal correspondence." Sail said, "Yes." The envoy said, "In the petition." Sail said, "Yes, I hadn't known about a petition. That was new information." The envoy looked at me again. "Your name was cited 43 times in the Velthara colony's formal complaint record, submitted to the Korthal Review Commission 6 months ago, in evidence of systemic administrative neglect of the colony." I said, 43. I wasn't aware they'd kept that detailed a record. The envoy said, "They are meticulous." I said, "Yes, they are. Their requisition lists are the most accurate I receive on this entire route." Another silence. Around us, the yard had gone quiet in a way that was not emptiness. There were dozens of bodies in it, Velthara and Korthal both, but a held stillness, the kind that happens when something is about to settle. The envoy said, "I am told you have been running this route for 11 months, I said. "Coming up on 12, and you came every Thursday. It's on my route sheet." The envoy looked at me for a moment, in a way I couldn't fully read. I'm not going to claim I can read a first envoy of the Korthal Empire. I'm a freight driver from Korval Junction. But what I could say was that the look did not make me feel small. It made me feel seen in the particular way that is uncomfortable and clarifying at the same time, like stepping into direct sunlight from a room you didn't know was dim. The envoy said, "We have been reviewing the colony's administrative record." I said, "The one on file with the colony authority?" I flagged a number of errors in it. I'd recommend looking at the original requisition archive before relying on the main record. There were population count discrepancies. The envoy said, "Yes, we found those." A pause. Around us, the yard had begun its slow morning organization. Velthara settling into positions. The sun spreading along the eastern fence starting. The amber glow moving over the ground as they angled into the light. The Korthal officers had stilled, most of them, and were watching this conversation without appearing to watch it. I've driven enough routes through enough administrative situations to know what watching, without appearing to watch, looks like. I didn't make anything of it. We also found the 15 administrative complaints filed over 11 months by a freight driver operating under the Colony Authority's logistics contract. They are the only documentation of consistent external advocacy in the colony's administrative record, I said. Some of them didn't get results. The nutritional standards review is still pending. The envoy said, it has been closed. In the Velthara's favor. We closed it this morning. I wrote that in the margin of my trip log in my head. Made a note to update the file when I got back to the truck. I said, good. The allocation multiplier was wrong by about 30%. It should make a real difference. The envoy looked at me for one more moment, then at Sael, then back at me. The envoy said, the Korthal formal recognition procedures require the first envoy to ask, in the presence of the colonial community being recognized, whether there are those outside the bloodline who have served the community's continuity and welfare. This is not a ceremonial question. It carries administrative weight. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I said. I understand you're asking me a formal question. Yes, I said. Then I'd like to answer it carefully. I drove a freight route every Thursday. I filed complaints when the allocations were wrong, because they were wrong. And filing complaints when things are wrong is what you do. I'm not owed anything for that. I don't know what weight it carries in your procedures, but from where I'm standing, what the Velthara are owed is a correct nutritional allocation and a maintained water recycling contract, and an administrative record that doesn't call their bloodline marker a defect. That's what I'd want to carry weight. The envoy was silent. Sael said, from the corner of the loading dock, in a voice that I had only heard once before and would not forget, he calls the young one pale. He leaves food on the gatepost. I hadn't known she knew that. The envoy's expression, in the language of a face structured very differently from mine, moved in a way I couldn't entirely parse, but that had the quality of something settling. Then the envoy stepped forward and placed a claw on the signature line of my manifest. The administrative pad registered. The form closed. The envoy handed back the hard copy and said, the confirmation signature for the delivery of 3 weeks past. Your records are correct. The acknowledgement is formal and complete. I folded the hard copy, put it in the delivery board sleeve. Thank you, I said. I'll have next week's allocation ready by Thursday. I know what happened after. I know it because of the administrative filings that came through the Colony Authority's logistics system over the following months. And because Ferris called me about 6 of them, and because the changes were reflected in the supply orders I was running. The Velthara colony at Tharan Resettlement Depot was formally recognized by the Korthal Empire as the Velthara Origin Community, the sole surviving established colony of the first strain bloodline, previously classified as extinct. The depot's status was changed from non-commercial drop point to recognized cultural site, which carried different administrative protections and a different maintenance category. The budget allocation was revised upward by an amount that made the Colony Authority's supply office contact me to confirm the new order volumes were correct. I confirmed them. The water recycling system was replaced with a current model unit with a full service contract. The nutritional block allocation was recalculated based on actual colony composition. The chain link fence was eventually replaced, though that took most of another year through the usual procurement channels. The Korvth Reach filed objections. The objections were reviewed and declined in a document I never read in full, but that Ferris said ran to several hundred pages. The 22 dragons listed under inventory variants were the subject of a separate formal inquiry, the results of which I also don't have in full, and which I don't think I'm going to see. The sign on the original gate, defective stock processing, Velthara Sabreed Holding, was taken down. I was there when it happened, by coincidence, because it was a Thursday. I watched a Colony Authority maintenance crew unmount it. I I watched Sale watch them do it. When it came off, she looked at the space on the gate where it had been for 14 months, the slightly lighter rectangle where the paint hadn't weathered at the same rate. And she held her eyes there for a moment in a way that had the quality of accounting. Then she looked at me. I held up the delivery board. She came to the gate and signed. I kept running the Thursday route. I still do. The access road was eventually repaired. That happened about 4 months after the formal recognition, once the site's maintenance category changed and the road came under a different funding classification. The drive out to Theron is smoother now, which my truck's suspension appreciates. Pale grew. He was bigger by the end of the second year, his joints having settled into their adult configuration, and his scales had developed more of the iridescent quality that was apparently, according to the Corthal archivists, one of the specific markers of the first strain that showed in the young most clearly and faded slightly with age. The archivists had a name for it in their own language. I'd been given a written transliteration that I kept in my corrections file, though I couldn't pronounce it, that translated to something like the light beneath the surface, which seemed right to me, as descriptions go. That was exactly what it was. Not a reflection, but an emanation, something internal. He stopped sitting exactly 2 meters from the gate, which I noticed because patterns matter. He started sitting close enough that I could have reached through the chain link and touched his flank, which I didn't do because I'm not that kind of person. But he left a stone on the gate post every few months. Always a different stone, always pale and smooth, and I couldn't have told you where he was finding them. I have 6 of them now, lined up in the door pocket of the truck. Sale spoke to me most Thursdays after that first time. Not long conversations. She wasn't a creature who used words as padding, and I'm not one either, so we were well matched in that respect. But she told me things. She told me the Velthara had a word for the color of their scales in their own language, the full name of which I couldn't reproduce, but which translated, she said, approximately as the light inside the first egg. She told me the morning singing was called, in their tradition, the giving of the daily account, a naming of what was present, what had continued, what had been kept. She said that in the old tradition, each voice in the colony sang what it had held through the night, and the combined sound was the colony's reckoning. We are still here. We have not lost this. This is what remains. She told me that the singing was done in their home range, in the mountains, in the morning air that came off the snowfields, and that the acoustics of the Theron yard were not ideal. I said I'd see what could be done about the acoustic baffling on the eastern habitat units. She said that was not what she meant. I said I knew. I kept the stone from the first week in the door pocket. The one pail left the third time I brought lunch. The Pale River stone with no river for 40 kilometers. On long drives between stops, I sometimes reach my hand into the door pocket without looking and feel the smooth surface of it under my thumb, worn and certain, and I don't think anything in particular. It's just there, like the route, like the turn onto the access road every Thursday, like the gate and whoever is waiting at it, and the morning light coming in level from the east, and the sound that starts below hearing and moves up through it, and the amber glow of it moving across the ground. I think about what the envoy said, about the formal question that carries administrative weight, about whether I have an answer I'd stand by in more complicated circumstances. Here's what I've come to over the time since. The question assumed I had done something exceptional. I don't think that's quite right, and I want to be precise about why, because the distinction matters to me. What I did was notice that the allocations were wrong. That is not exceptional. That is basic competence. What I did was file corrections when I noticed errors. That is not courage. That is the job. What I did was come back the next Thursday and the Thursday after that, because it was on the route sheet and I am a person who keeps to route sheets. None of those things, separately or together, rise to the level of exceptional. They rise to the level of ordinary, done consistently over time. The thing that I think actually mattered, and this is harder to say clearly, was not any individual correction or any individual Thursday. It was the aggregate, the accumulated weight of showing up correctly, reliably, without making it into something larger than it was. The Velthara didn't need a champion. They didn't need someone to arrive with a flag and a speech about dignity and injustice. They needed someone to correct the nutritional allocation and make sure the water recycling unit had a maintenance contract and write down what was wrong so it could be made right. They needed someone to be present in the specific, useful, undrammatic way that someone running a route is present, with a clipboard and a corrections file, and enough patience to file the same form 3 times until it cleared. I could do that. I knew how to do that. I had 11 years of knowing how to do that, so I did it. Here's the thing about freight driving that people who don't do it sometimes don't understand. You're not just moving boxes from one place to another. You're maintaining a connection. The route exists because the connection matters, because something at the other end of the road needs what you're bringing, and something at your end needs to know it was received. You're the proof every week that the line holds. You can't be sentimental about it. Sentiment makes you late, makes you inaccurate, makes you fill out the paperwork wrong. You have to look at the manifest clearly and see what's correct and what's incorrect and file the necessary corrections and do it again the next week. That's the job. But within that, within doing the job correctly, which is just doing the job, you notice things. You notice that the allocation is wrong. You notice that the maintenance contract has lapsed. You notice that someone has been waiting at the gate before you ring it every Thursday for months because she has learned that Thursday is the day someone shows up. And you think, that's not sentimental, it's observational. The data says something is wrong. The data says, this colony is here. It has needs that the administrative record isn't meeting. The administrative record needs to be corrected. You correct it. You come back next Thursday. You correct more of it. That's not heroic. I want to be clear about that. Because the colony authority people who called after the formal recognition had a tendency to use language I found faintly embarrassing, words like dedication and advocacy and going above and beyond, which are fine words, but not how I would describe the experience from the inside. The experience from the inside was, there was a route. There was a stop on the route. The stop had needs that weren't being met, and the system for meeting them was accessible to anyone who had the time to work it correctly. I had the time. I worked it correctly. What I was at Theron Resettlement Depot was present every Thursday, with the manifest and the delivery board and whatever corrections I'd gotten through that week and my lunch and later the stone in the door pocket. Present the way you have to be on a route, which is reliably, predictably, in the same way at the same time, because the reliability is most of what you're offering. The Velthara didn't need a hero. They needed someone to keep showing up, that I could do. The Thursday after the formal recognition ceremony, which I didn't attend, though I was invited, it was a Wednesday, and I had 28 other stops. I drove out to Theron on the regular schedule. The road had been cleared after the convoy vehicles had gone through, and someone had filled the worst of the potholes with temporary compound. Not a permanent fix, I noted in the log. Follow up on road maintenance contract. That went in the correction queue for the following week, and was approved, as it happened, in 3 days. The new site maintenance category moved things through faster than the old one had. I noted that too. The gate was open as it usually was now. The yard was its regular Thursday self. The morning routines, the sun spreading along the eastern fence, the careful daily maintenance rounds. The new water recycling unit was visible through the habitat unit gap, running quietly, its indicator lights green. That still gave me something every time I saw it. Not pride exactly, more the specific satisfaction of a thing that was wrong being right. It's a modest feeling. I'm a modest person. Pale was in his spot, not the 2-meter radius that had been his young one's distance, but the spot he'd taken up since he was bigger, closer to the gate, angled so the morning light caught his iridescent scales at the particular angle that showed them best. He watched me park, His amber-orange eyes tracked me from the truck to the loading dock with the same attention they always had. I nodded at him when I got out. He held his position. That was our routine now, and routine, as I have had occasion to say before, is most of what you're offering. Sale was at the loading dock. I put the delivery board down. I went through the manifest, new allocation, confirmed correction on the nutritional multiplier, the maintenance contract, confirmation for the new unit, and one addition I'd managed to get approved after 3 submissions. A weekly fresh supply run of the aerobic mineral compound that the Korthal archivists had identified as beneficial for first strain scale maintenance, which the original allocation hadn't included because no one had known to include it. Sale signed each line. She checked each item. When she finished, she looked at the full manifest for a moment. She said, "The mineral compound." I said, "Third submission." I cited the Korthal archivist documentation and filed it under the new site maintenance category. It cleared Monday. She looked at it a moment more. Then she handed back the hard copy. She said, "We will sing this morning if you have time. The Eastern unit's baffling is better since the repairs. The acoustics have improved." I checked my trip log. Stop 12. Theron Resettlement Depot. 11 more stops after this. Usual Thursday schedule. I said, "I've got a few minutes." I sat on the loading dock edge with my back against the dock wall and my trip log on my knee. Not because I had paperwork to do, but because that's where I sit, and the sun was coming in from the east. And the light through the Velthara wing membranes was that particular quality I had never found a word for, moving slowly over the ground as they shifted to face the sun. The singing started below the range of hearing. Felt it in the sternum first, then the inner ear, then it was everywhere. In the ground under the dock, in the dry morning air, in the chalk smell of the flats stretching away to the horizon. It rose and held and had a structure to it I was hearing with more recognition now than I had the first time, a pattern I couldn't name but that my body had learned over 12 months of Thursday mornings. I sat there with my trip log on my knee, in the sun, and I listened. When it was done, I stood up, got the delivery board, walked back to the truck. Sale was already crossing the yard to her morning business. Pale watched me from his spot until I rounded the hood, then probably looked elsewhere. I didn't check. I'm not sentimental. I got in, set the trip log on the seat beside me, put the truck in gear. 13 stops to go. Same route as always. I pulled out of the gate and turned onto the access road and drove.